What if I told you that 600 years ago, people were so desperate to grow back their hair that they willingly rubbed fresh animal dung into their scalps every single morning? Not just once, not as a joke, but as a serious medical treatment that they believed would save their social lives, their marriages, and their very identity. Tonight, we're going to uncover one of history's most revolting beauty secrets. A cure so disgusting that it would make you gag just thinking about it. But here's what will really shock you. It was wildly popular, recommended by doctors, and people swore it worked. You're about to discover why intelligent, reasonable human beings chose to live with the smell of rotting manure in their hair rather than accept baldness. Picture this for a moment. You wake up in medieval Europe and you notice your hairline is starting to recede. In our world today, you might feel a little self-conscious. Maybe look into some treatments or simply accept it as part of aging. But in medieval times, losing your hair wasn't just about vanity. It was about survival. Your hair determined whether you could find work, whether someone would marry you, whether you'd be respected in your community, or treated like a social outcast. Think about the last time you had a bad hair day. Remember that feeling of not wanting to leave the house, of feeling like everyone was staring at you? Now multiply that feeling by 1,000 and imagine it lasting for the rest of your life. That's what baldness meant in medieval Europe. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about whether you could participate in society at all. In medieval times, your hair was considered a divine gift, a sign of God's favor upon you. Religious texts spoke of hair as a symbol of strength, vitality, and spiritual connection. When you started losing your hair, it wasn't just a cosmetic problem. People believed it meant you were somehow spiritually deficient, that you had fallen out of favor with God Himself. The social pressure was crushing, and the desperation was real. But what they tried to fix it will make your stomach turn. The cure we're about to explore was so disgusting, yet so widely accepted, that entire communities would gather to help prepare it. Families would pass down these revolting recipes through generations, treating them like precious family secrets. Are you ready to discover what medieval people were willing to endure in their desperate quest to keep their hair? Let me take you back to a time when desperation met medieval medicine, when people believed that the grosser the cure, the more powerful it must be. You're about to enter a world where logic took a back seat to hope, where the fear of social death drove people to extremes that would horrify us today. This isn't just a story about hair loss. It's a story about human nature, about what we're willing to do when we're afraid, and about how far we'll go to fit in. The medieval world operated on a completely different understanding of how the human body worked. Imagine walking into a medieval physician's chamber with its flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air would be thick with the smell of herbs, animal parts, and substances you wouldn't want to identify. This was the pinnacle of medical knowledge, and people trusted these doctors with their lives. Medieval doctors built their entire practice around something called the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that every illness, every condition, every problem with your body came from an imbalance of these four substances. It sounds crazy to us now, but to them, it was scientific fact. They had elaborate charts, complex calculations, and detailed explanations for how these humors controlled everything from your personality to your physical appearance. When it came to baldness, medieval doctors had it all figured out. They believed that hair loss was caused by excess heat in the body, combined with corrupted humors that were somehow poisoning your scalp from the inside. Think about how logical this seemed to them. Your hair was literally falling out, so obviously something inside you must be wrong. The solution seemed clear. They needed to cool down your scalp and balance your humors. This is where the medieval mind began to work in ways that would seem completely insane to us today. If the problem was internal heat and corrupted humors, then the solution had to be something that could cool and cleanse. And what better way to do that than with natural substances that were known to be fertile and life-giving? After all, they reasoned, fertile soil grows healthy plants. So fertile substances should grow healthy hair. The medieval approach to medicine was built on the principle that the more disgusting something was, the more powerful it must be. They believed that truly effective medicine had to be difficult to take, had to challenge your body and your spirit. Pleasant-tasting medicine was considered weak and ineffective. If you weren't suffering while taking your medicine, it probably wasn't working. This twisted logic led them to believe that the cure for baldness had to be something that would test your resolve, something that would prove your commitment to getting better. They were looking for ingredients that were natural, fertile, and available to everyone. The main ingredient was something that every medieval household produced in abundance, something that was fresh, warm, and believed to contain the essence of life itself. Medieval apothecary shops were filled with ingredients that would make your skin crawl. Dried animal parts hung from the ceiling. Jars of mysterious liquids lined the shelves, and the smell was beyond description. But the cure for baldness didn't even require a trip to the apothecary. The main ingredient was readily available in every medieval household, produced fresh every single day by the animals that shared their living spaces. Are you ready to discover what medieval people rubbed into their scalps every morning? What they mixed into thick pastes and massaged into their hair before going to sleep? What they endured the smell of day after day because they believed it would save their social lives? The cure that made medieval people gag, but they used it anyway because the alternative, being bald, was simply too horrible to consider. Take a deep breath Because what you're about to learn will change how you think about desperation, about human nature, and about what people are willing to endure when they're afraid. The medieval cure for baldness was fresh animal dung, specifically cow manure, mixed with various types of animal excrement, rubbed directly into the scalp and left there for hours or even overnight. Yes, you heard that correctly. Medieval people, desperate to regrow their hair, would collect fresh animal dung, the fresher the better, and rub it into their scalps like a modern hair treatment. They would massage it in thoroughly, making sure every inch of their scalp was covered, and then go about their daily lives with animal feces matted into their hair. The smell was overwhelming, the texture was revolting, and the social implications were staggering. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. This wasn't something people did in secret, hiding their shame from the world. This was a recommended medical treatment, prescribed by doctors, supported by the community, and practiced openly. Imagine sitting in a medieval church, surrounded by people who had rubbed cow dung into their hair that morning. The collective smell would have been unbearable, but it was so normal that nobody even commented on it. The process was elaborate and ritualistic. People would wake up before dawn and make their way to the animal pens. They would collect the freshest dung they could find, still warm from the animal's body, because they believed that fresh dung contained more life force than older, dry dung. They would then mix it with various other substances: horse manure for strength, goat droppings for fertility, sometimes even human waste for what they believe. Imagine trying to have a conversation with someone who had fresh animal dung in their hair. Imagine the smell in their homes, on their clothes, on everything they touched. Imagine the flies it attracted, the infections it caused, the social isolation it created. But they endured all of this because they believed it was their only hope of avoiding the social death that came with baldness. The medieval logic behind this treatment was actually quite sophisticated in its own twisted way. They believed that just as fertile soil produces healthy plants, fertile dung would produce healthy hair. They reasoned that animals with thick, healthy coats must have something in their waste that promoted hair growth. The heat from fresh dung was believed to stimulate the scalp, while the natural fertility of the manure would encourage new hair follicles to grow. Different regions had their own preferred variations of this treatment. In some areas, people swore by pure cow dung, believing that cows had the thickest, most lustrous coats. In others, they preferred horse manure, thinking that horses' manes held the secret to hair growth. Some communities mixed different types of animal waste together, creating elaborate recipes that were passed down through generations like precious family secrets. The wealthy had access to more exotic variations of this treatment. They might mix their dung with expensive herbs, rare oils, or even ground precious stones. They believed that the more expensive the additional ingredients, the more effective the treatment would be. But the core ingredient was always the same: fresh animal feces, applied directly to the scalp with the same care and attention we might give to a modern hair treatment. The seasonal variations were particularly gruesome. In winter, when animals were kept indoors, the dung was believed to be more potent because it was warmer and fresher. In summer, people would add herbs and flowers to the mixture, creating a revolting combination that was somehow supposed to be more pleasant. But pleasant was never the point. Effectiveness was all that mattered, and they measured effectiveness by how disgusting the treatment was. The social implications of this treatment were staggering. Imagine trying to maintain relationships when you smelled like a barnyard. Imagine the impact on marriages, friendships, and professional relationships. People who used this treatment often found themselves increasingly isolated, which only made their desperation worse. They would double down on the treatment, using more dung, applying it more frequently, convinced that they just needed to try harder for it to work. The health consequences were predictably horrific. The dung would cause severe scalp infections, rashes, and sometimes even life-threatening diseases. The bacteria in animal waste would attack the already damaged hair follicles, often making hair loss worse rather than better. People would develop painful sores, lose even more hair, and sometimes die from the infections they gave themselves. But they interpreted these symptoms as signs that the treatment was working, that their body was purging the bad humors that caused their baldness. The irony was cruel and absolute. The very treatment they used to cure their hair loss was often the thing that made it worse. The infections would damage their scalp tissue. The bacteria would attack their hair follicles, and the constant irritation would cause inflammation that prevented any possibility of hair regrowth. They were literally poisoning themselves in an attempt to cure a condition that was probably just natural aging. But the dung treatment wasn't the only horrific cure medieval people used for baldness. Once you understand the medieval mindset that effective medicine had to be disgusting, that natural substances were always better than artificial ones, that the more you suffered, the more likely you were to be cured, you can start to imagine the other treatments they developed. Human and animal urine was another popular treatment for hair loss. People would collect their own urine, or sometimes the urine of healthy animals, and use it as a hair rinse. They believed that urine contained the essence of life, that it was a natural cleanser that would remove the corrupted humors from their scalp. The process was similar to the dung treatment. They would pour the urine over their head, massage it into their scalp, and leave it there for hours. The urine treatment was often combined with other revolting ingredients. Some people would mix urine with crushed herbs, creating a paste that they would apply to their scalp. Others would ferment the urine for days or weeks, believing that aged urine was more potent than fresh. The smell was indescribable, the texture was revolting, and the social consequences were severe. People persisted because they believed it was working, because they convinced themselves that any change in their scalp condition was a sign of improvement. Animal blood was another popular ingredient in medieval hair treatments. People would collect fresh blood from slaughtered animals and rub it into their scalp, believing that the life force contained in the blood would stimulate hair growth. They would sometimes mix the blood with other substances, crushed animal organs, ground bones, or various bodily fluids, creating mixtures that were beyond disgusting. The organ-based treatments were particularly revolting. People would take the organs of animals, livers, kidneys, hearts, and either apply them directly to their scalp or they believed that each organ had specific properties that would help with hair growth. Liver was supposed to strengthen the hair. Kidneys were believed to cleanse the scalp, and heart was thought to give the hair vital energy. Some treatments involved living creatures. People would apply live insects, worms, or larvae to their scalp, believing that these creatures would somehow stimulate hair growth. They would create elaborate contraptions to keep the insects on their head, enduring the crawling, biting, and stinging because they believed it was therapeutic. The psychological torture of having insects crawling on your scalp was seen as part of the healing process. Poisonous plants were commonly used in medieval hair treatments, often with deadly consequences. People would crush toxic herbs and apply them to their scalp, not realizing that they were poisoning themselves through their skin. But because some people experienced temporary changes in their scalp condition before the poison killed them, these treatments were considered effective. The preparation of these treatments was often a community activity. Families would gather to help collect ingredients, mix the various substances, and apply them to the patient's scalp. Children would be sent to collect dung, urine, or other revolting ingredients. Neighbors would share their own secret recipes, and communities would come together to support someone going through treatment. The social aspect of these treatments made them even more powerful. People felt like they were part of something larger, like their community was helping them fight their condition. Religious blessing was often incorporated into these treatments. Priests would be asked to bless the revolting mixtures before they were applied, adding spiritual power to the physical treatment. People believed that God wanted them to suffer in order to be healed, that the more disgusting the treatment, the more it proved their faith and devotion. This religious component made it even harder for people to abandon these treatments. Doing so would feel like giving up on God Himself. The treatments were often passed down through generations, like precious family heirlooms. Mothers would teach their daughters the exact recipes. Fathers would pass down the secret techniques to their sons. And grandparents would share their wisdom about which ingredients were most effective. These family traditions created a powerful psychological investment in the treatments. Abandoning them would feel like betraying your ancestors and their accumulated wisdom. But why did people endure these horrific treatments? What drove them to such extremes? The answer lies in understanding what baldness meant in medieval society. Your hair determined your place in the social hierarchy, your ability to find work, your chances of marriage, and your standing in the community. Losing your hair meant losing your identity, your future, and your hope. In medieval Europe, life expectancy was short and brutal. People lived in constant fear of disease, death, and social catastrophe. In this context, hair loss wasn't just a cosmetic problem. It was a sign that you were already beginning to die, that you were becoming less human, less worthy of respect and love. The fear of baldness was really a fear of death itself, and people were willing to risk everything to avoid it. The economic implications of hair loss were severe. In a world where your appearance determined your ability to find work, baldness could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Merchants with thinning hair would lose customers, craftsmen would lose apprentices, and farmers would. The economic pressure to maintain a full head of hair was enormous, and the cost of these treatments seems small compared to the cost of being bald. Marriage prospects were directly tied to hair health. Women with thinning hair were considered unmarriageable, doomed to a life of poverty and social isolation. Men with receding hairlines were seen as weak and unattractive, unlikely to find wives or produce healthy children. In a world where marriage was essential for survival, hair loss was a death sentence that people would do anything to avoid. The social hierarchy in medieval times was rigid and unforgiving. Your place in society was determined by your appearance, your health, and your perceived vitality. Baldness marked you as someone who was declining, someone who was losing their life force, someone who was becoming less worthy of respect. The social pressure to maintain your hair but there was another factor that made these treatments so persistent: the power of belief. Medieval people had absolute faith in their doctors, their religious leaders, and their community wisdom. When multiple authorities told them that dung treatments worked, they believed it completely. When they saw occasional coincidental improvements in people's hair, they attributed it to the treatment rather than natural variation. The power of belief made these treatments seem effective, even when they were clearly making things worse. The psychological investment in these treatments was enormous. People would spend months or years applying revolting substances to their scalp, enduring the smell, the infections, and the social isolation. The more they suffered, the more invested they became in the treatment's success. Admitting that the treatment wasn't working would mean admitting that all their suffering had been for nothing, that they had poisoned themselves and isolated themselves from their community for no reason. success stories were powerful motivators, even when they were completely false. If someone's hair loss stopped naturally, or if they experienced some temporary improvement, the community would attribute it to the dung treatment. These rare success stories would spread through the community like wildfire, giving hope to everyone who was suffering. The fact that dozens of people might try the treatment and fail for every one person who seemed to improve didn't matter. The hope was enough to keep people trying. The treatments became addictive in a psychological sense. People would become dependent on the ritual, the hope, and the sense of doing something about their condition. Even when the treatments clearly weren't working, even when they were making things worse, people would continue because the alternative, accepting their baldness and giving up hope, was too painful to consider. The community pressure was intense. Everyone in the village would know who was using these treatments, who was giving up, and who was still fighting. Stopping the treatment would be seen as giving up, as admitting defeat, as letting the community down. The social expectation to keep trying was so strong that people would continue poisoning themselves rather than face the judgment of their neighbors. The gender differences in these treatments were particularly cruel. Women faced even more pressure than men to maintain their hair because their entire social value was tied to their appearance. A bald woman was considered completely unmarriageable, a social outcast who would never find love or respect. Women would often use more extreme treatments, apply them more frequently, and endure greater suffering because the stakes were higher for them. Men faced different but equally intense pressures. Baldness was seen as a sign of weakness, of declining vitality, of being less masculine. Men would often combine hair treatments with other attempts to prove their strength and virility, creating elaborate rituals that were supposed to restore their full manhood. The psychological pressure on men to maintain their hair was tied to their entire identity as providers and protectors. Class distinctions affected how people approached these treatments. The wealthy could afford more exotic and expensive variations, but they still used the same basic ingredients: animal waste, urine, blood, and other revolting substances. The poor had to make do with whatever they could find, often using human waste or the dung of less desirable animals. But everyone, regardless of social class, was using essentially the same disgusting treatments. Age factors played a role in how people approached these treatments. Young people who were just beginning to lose their hair would often try the most extreme treatments, believing that early intervention was key to success. Older people who had been losing hair for years would sometimes become more desperate, trying increasingly revolting combinations of ingredients. The timing of when someone started treatment often determined how far they would go in their desperation. The gradual awakening to the futility of these treatments was a slow and painful process. It took centuries for people to begin questioning the logic behind dung treatments, urine rinses, and blood applications. The change came gradually, driven by improvements in hygiene, advances in medical understanding, and slowly shifting social attitudes toward cleanliness and health. The first signs of change came when people began to notice the connection between these treatments and the infections they caused. As medical knowledge slowly advanced, some doctors began to question whether substances that cause disease could really be effective treatments. The concept of contamination began to emerge, and people started to understand that putting filthy substances on their bodies might be making them sick rather than healing them. The transition away from these treatments was gradual and uneven. Some people abandoned them quickly once they understood the health risks, while others continued using them for generations. Regional variations were significant. Some areas gave up these treatments much earlier than others, depending on local medical knowledge, social attitudes, and economic conditions. The Renaissance brought new ideas about medicine as scientific thinking began to replace superstition. People started to question the logic behind treatments that seemed to cause more harm than good. The printing press allowed new medical knowledge to spread more quickly, and people began to have access to alternative explanations for hair loss and aging. Religious attitudes toward cleanliness began to change during this period. The idea that suffering was necessary for healing began to give way to the belief that God wanted people to be clean and healthy. This shift in religious thinking made it easier for people to abandon treatments that were clearly causing suffering without providing benefits. The development of wigs and other hair coverings provided an alternative to these revolting treatments. As it became socially acceptable to cover hair loss rather than cure it, people had a way to address their appearance concerns without poisoning themselves. This option was particularly important for wealthy people who could afford high-quality wigs that looked natural. The gradual improvement in overall health and life expectancy made hair loss seem less catastrophic. As people lived longer and healthier lives, losing hair became more normalized as a natural part of aging rather than a sign of impending death. This shift in perspective made it easier for people to accept hair loss without resorting to extreme treatments. But the change was slow and met with resistance. Many people clung to these treatments long after they were proven ineffective, partly because of psychological investment and partly because of social pressure. Families that had used these treatments for generations found it difficult to abandon them, even when they clearly weren't working. The final holdouts were often in rural areas where access to new medical knowledge was limited and traditional practices were more entrenched. Some communities continued using these treatments well into the modern era, passing them down through families who had never been exposed to alternative explanations for hair loss. Economic factors also played a role in the persistence of these treatments. People who couldn't afford wigs or other alternatives, continued using free treatments based on animal waste, even when they knew they weren't effective. The desperation of poverty made people willing to try anything, no matter how revolting or dangerous. The gradual fade of these practices was ultimately driven by a combination of factors: improved medical knowledge, better hygiene practices, changing social attitudes, and the availability of alternatives. But the process took centuries, and the psychological and social forces that drove people to these extremes persisted long after the treatments themselves. Looking back at this dark chapter in medical history, we can see how desperation, combined with lack of scientific knowledge and social pressure, can drive people to extremes that seem incomprehensible to us today. The medieval cure for baldness wasn't just about hair. It was about fear, identity, social survival, and the human willingness to suffer in pursuit of hope. The story of these treatments teaches us something important about human nature. When we're afraid, when we're desperate, when our identity is threatened, we're capable of extraordinary self-deception and self-harm. The medieval people who rubbed dung into their scalps, people still spend enormous amounts of money on treatments that don't work, still try unproven remedies, still let their fear of baldness drive them to extremes. The substances may be different, but the underlying psychology is the same. The fear of losing our identity, our attractiveness, our social standing. The medieval experience with baldness cures also shows us the power of community beliefs and social pressure. When everyone around you believes something works, when your doctors recommend it, when your family supports it, it becomes very difficult to question that belief, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. The social reinforcement of these treatments was as powerful as any individual psychological factor. But perhaps most importantly, this story shows us how far we've come in our understanding of medicine, hygiene, and human health. The scientific method, evidence-based medicine, and our modern understanding of disease and treatment have saved us from the kind of desperate suffering that medieval people endured. We're not smarter than they were. We're just better informed. The legacy of these treatments lives on in folklore, in historical accounts, and in the occasional modern person who tries similar remedies out of desperation. The human tendency to believe that effective treatment must be difficult, that natural is always better, that suffering is necessary for healing. These beliefs persist even today, driving people to try unproven treatments and ignore established medical advice. As we drift towards sleep tonight, we can feel grateful for the progress humanity has made. We can appreciate the luxury of living in a time when hair loss is a cosmetic concern rather than a social death sentence. When we have safe and effective treatments available, when we understand that medicine should heal rather than harm. The medieval people who suffered through these treatments were just like us. They wanted to be loved, accepted, and respected. They feared aging, loneliness, and social rejection. Their methods were horrific, but their motivations were entirely human. In understanding their story, we understand something about ourselves, about what drives us, and about how far we're willing to go when we're afraid. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember that you live in an age of medical miracles compared to medieval times. You have access to treatments that actually work, doctors who understand how your body functions, and a society that values health over suffering. The next time you're tempted to try some unproven remedy, remember the medieval people who poisoned themselves with animal dung, and be grateful for the scientific knowledge that protects you from such desperate measures. The story of the disgusting medieval cure for baldness is ultimately a story about hope, desperation, and the human condition. It reminds us that throughout history, people have been willing to endure almost anything in pursuit of acceptance, love, and belonging. The substances may have been revolting, but the desires that drove people to use them were beautifully, tragically human. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake up in a world where effective medicine exists, where hygiene is understood, and where losing your hair doesn't mean losing your place in society. Dream of a future where our descendants will look back at our medical practices with the same mixture of horror and compassion that we feel for those medieval people, rubbing dung into their scalps, desperate for a cure that would never come.